Okay, here we are again. This is lecture 12. I'm going to push on into my discussion of Bentham and classical utilitarianism. I will, at the end of this lecture, say a few things about Mill. Mill is going to be the main topic next week, but we'll have a short preview at the end of this lecture with a brief discussion of Mill's famous 1868 parliamentary speech on capital punishment. But the main topic for today is still Bentham and the overall shape of classical utilitarianism generally. So in the last lecture, I was talking about Bentham's overall approach, and I was arguing that it rests on a kind of generalization or an analogy between rational individual choice and rational collective choice. According to Bentham, individuals who are rational ought to be basically egoists. Rational individuals should, and in fact do, seek their own welfare, where their own welfare is understood as a life with a minimum of pain and a maximum of pleasure. And if we buy that assumption about what it is for an individual to be rational, the utilitarians and Bentham want to say, well, the same is basically true. We can, by analogy, say the same thing about rational societies. A rational society is one that should and does seek the aggregate welfare of all of its members, with the greatest amount of pleasure overall and the least amount of pain overall. And you calculate this according, as I was saying in the last lecture, according to a formula that gives impartially equal weight to the welfare and happiness of each and every person. No special privileges to any particular social group. So what that implies is that there's a very basic utilitarian imperative, according to which it's an absolute deontological, in the sense I talked about in the last lecture, rational responsibility or requirement or a kind of duty, although it's not really an ethical duty at this level, it's more of a kind of rational duty, a duty imposed just by the light of our natural reason, that overall welfare be increased as far as possible. A society that fails to achieve that goal is to be criticized for Bentham as unconditionally irrational. And this, of course, means that utilitarianism sets a very demanding critical standard. Any social practice, any system of norms, any institutional order becomes open to criticism if it systematically suppresses human welfare. And that gives the utility principle a potentially very powerful critical edge. It becomes, and Bentham and Mill and the other classical utilitarians fully intend this, it gives it a very powerful potential as an agent of social and political reform. And it's important to keep this in mind because Bentham and Mill and the other classical utilitarians, they were not academics. They were not people who were interested in abstract intellectual philosophical speculation. They thought of themselves, first and foremost, as political reformers. And I talked about this in one of the very early lectures, that it's a characteristic of modern political theory that it aims at the reform and improvement of human life and human institutions. And the classical utilitarians are archetypical in this regard. They are the progressives of their age. They were known in their time as the philosophic radicals, and they understand themselves and were understood as radicals in the sense that they were constantly trying to push human societies to improve themselves through various schemes of reform. And Bentham and Mill were both engaged politically in various such schemes, in proposing them, in agitating for them, in trying to see them realized. So keep in mind that Bentham and Mill think of themselves as actively contributing to a progressive project of social and political reform. Now, there's an obvious problem that will have occurred to all of you, I'm sure, about this utilitarian project. What exactly is the relationship in utilitarianism between individual self-interest and the greatest happiness of the greatest number? As I said in the last lecture, utilitarianism rests on an analogy between those two things, but in the end, it gives priority to the latter. That is, it says that where there's a conflict between what's in one's personal interest and what would promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number, the utilitarian says that social welfare trumps individual welfare. The utility principle takes priority over individual egoism, right? But that raises, of course, a lot of concerns about exactly how Bentham and the utilitarians understood the relationship between collective benevolence, doing the best thing for everyone, and this postulate of individual egoistic, self-interested rationality. And this worry sometimes surfaces, of course, as a substantive objection to utilitarianism, one that utilitarianism's critics very often emphasize. And the worry is this: why should we expect a few individuals, especially if they're self-interested, why is it reasonable to expect them to accept perhaps very large personal sacrifices in order to promote a better outcome for more others, right? This line of argument was made very, very effectively in the late 20th century by a number of philosophers. John Rawls, I've already mentioned. You find the same argument in Robert Nozick, whom some of you will have read. Bernard Williams, famous philosopher of the late 20th century, made a similar kind of argument, that there's something basically unjust about the utilitarian proposal because it implies that there are conditions under which it's not just permissible, but perhaps even required for us to impose potentially catastrophic burdens on the few in order to bring about a better outcome for the many. And a lot of people have the intuition that that is unacceptable. It violates individuals' rights to decide according to their own lights how to live. We can't just involuntarily sacrifice the few for the sake of the many. And that's an important worry about classical utilitarianism. I'll say a few things in later lectures to perhaps offer a response on behalf of classical utilitarianism to that general worry. But I don't want to focus on it now. I think it'll be more helpful if we address that larger question after we've got more of the utilitarian apparatus and Mill's view in particular out on the table. So I'm going to postpone discussion of that. But there's a more technical aspect of this issue that we can't avoid, and indeed is important to confront because it will help to clarify exactly what Bentham is up to. And this more technical issue is one that the utilitarians themselves recognized and indeed have wrestled with really throughout the entire tradition right up to the present. And the technical issue can be put in the following way. Bentham thinks that individual egoism is rational. So how can it also be rational if the rational thing for individuals to do is to maximize their own personal welfare? How can it also at the same time be rational for agents to act in accordance with the greatest happiness principle? It's not obvious that doing what will promote the general welfare is always going to be in my personal interest. And so, as I've said already, the utilitarians want to say, look, the general welfare always trumps personal self-interest, but when there's a conflict, why is it rational, therefore, for me to accept something that will, in a conflict case, that will actually suppress my personal welfare? That doesn't seem rational at all. It seems to be something that is fundamentally against my rational self-interest. And that, of course, creates an internal tension within the utilitarian position. And as I've said, this is a worry that the utilitarians themselves recognized. Throughout the tradition, utilitarians have struggled to explain this. At the end of the 19th century, one of the very greatest of the classical utilitarians, whom very few people bother to read anymore, the English philosopher Henry Sidgwick, wrote a big book called The Methods of Ethics, in which he struggled with this issue. He describes it as the dualism of practical reason, where practical reason here is reasoning about how we ought to act and how we ought to judge ethically. And Sidgwick attempts to reconcile individual self-interested egoism with the impartial benevolence of the greatest happiness principle. And as he famously says about the first edition of his book, that book ends with the word failure. So Sidgwick, who's a modest person, isn't entirely optimistic that his own effort to resolve this tension succeeds. He winds up with a view in which practical reason is to some extent at odds with itself in having two independent principles, one a principle of individual self-interest and another a principle of collective benevolence or impartial prudence for the group. And he can't, in the end, find a fully satisfactory way to reconcile these things. And utilitarian philosophers have struggled with this throughout the tradition. It's an issue that remains a live one today. Perhaps the most famous and influential contemporary utilitarian philosopher, Derek Parfit, who died a couple of years ago very sadly, ended his career with a massive tome, 2 volumes initially, and I think now there's a 3rd volume out. The title of that tome is On What Matters, and a good deal of the argumentation in this massive book is an attempt, again, another attempt to try to show why Bentham was actually correct to think that actually self-interest and collective welfare flow together and can be reconciled in a single unified conception of practical reason. So it remains a very hotly contested issue even among utilitarians. One of the ways in which this problem comes out substantively is it invites a charge of moral fanaticism, right? So utilitarianism seems to be requiring agents to be acting in ways that will benefit as many people as possible. But that might seem to imply that agents are supposed to be constantly calculating overall utilities and taking those actions that will genuinely maximize welfare. But if they're being, if they're constantly trying to think about the welfare of others and doing whatever will promote happiness in large numbers of other people, there's a worry, of course, that they'll eventually be so lost in this acting for the sake of others that their own self-interest will sort of recede into the background, and they'll be asked in this fanatical way to think constantly in an altruistic way and not in the egoistic way that Bentham and all the utilitarians thought is the natural starting point for our thinking about individual rational choice. So that's another way in which this problem surfaces. I think it's important to see, if we try to help Bentham out in reconstructing his view, it's important to see that Bentham does not in general assume that individuals ought to be constantly calculating how they personally can maximize overall welfare. And it's worth considering some of his implicit and in some cases explicit reasons for rejecting that view. One thing that Bentham says at various points is that if you just ask individuals to try individually on an independent basis to take that action which in their judgment will maximize overall utility for everyone, that's likely to be a losing gambit, because it's going to be very difficult for individuals acting independently to coordinate their choices and actions in a way that will in fact promote aggregate welfare. So if you just leave it to individuals to try to figure this out individually, the project is likely to be self-defeating. You'll end up with an outcome that is actually worse, because individuals will have great difficulty predicting what other people are going to do. And so in the absence of any coordination, it's quite likely that just trusting individuals to act in ways according to their own judgments that will maximize utility is very unlikely that that's going to produce an outcome that will in fact efficiently promote overall welfare. So Bentham assumes, with I think common sense, that in practice agents are going to have to rely on ingrained habits. They're going to have to follow rules and large-scale conventions and subscribe to various institutional expectations if they are together to behave in cooperative and utility-promoting ways. So Bentham recognizes that in order for the effort to promote overall welfare to be efficiently coordinated, it's not going to be enough just to leave it to individuals to work out separately for themselves. They're going to need the guidance of some overarching rules and principles and conventions, and they're going to have to comply with certain institutional expectations and practices if we're going to have a propitious outcome. Um, Secondly, this is something that's very often overlooked, but Bentham says it very, very clearly in the Deontology, which I asked you to read for this week. Bentham sees an important asymmetry in the power of any individual to do good, to produce good consequences, and their power to produce bad consequences. In most situations, he says, quote, the quantity of happiness which any individual, even the mightiest, can produce is small compared with the amount of misery he may create by himself or others. And what Bentham is pointing out there is that the normal human situation is one in which we actually have very limited powers through our own efforts to do a whole lot to improve or maximize the condition of everybody. But there's a standing possibility that by acting incorrectly in various ways, we will be very effective in producing misery and suffering in large numbers of others. And that, as will emerge in some of my later discussion, that's a very important consideration for Bentham, because it's going to lead Bentham to a kind of negative utilitarianism in which the most important thing for us to try to do is to dissuade individuals from acting in ways that will cause misery rather than persuading them to actively promote overall utility, because the power of any given individual to produce optimally satisfactory outcomes is in practice very, very limited. Thirdly, and more generally, Bentham, like all of the classical utilitarians, you'll see this in Mill too, is a realist about actual human motivation. As Bentham sees us, we typically act not on some very calculated, very self-conscious view about what we individually can do to promote overall utility. In the immediate case, we act on and face incentives and disincentives as they actually confront us in our day-to-day lives. And I want to emphasize this third feature particularly because Bentham's approach to it is informed by a distinctive psychological theory, one that is very often overlooked and that I think needs to be put out on the table if you're going to give his view a fair run for his money. I'm referring here in particular to his theory of what he calls sanctions. He thinks that in the ordinary course of events, human individuals respond to various kinds of motivational incentives and motivational disincentives that confront them with prospects of pleasure and pain, and he calls these sanctions, right? He calls these sanctions that incline us towards certain kinds of actions and incline us against other kinds of actions. And I want to spend just a little bit of time reconstructing this account of the sanctions of utility, as Bentham calls them. At the heart of this idea is that Bentham believes, and surely he's right about this in a kind of at a realist level, Bentham thinks that the pleasures and pains that actually confront us in ordinary experience present themselves in the form of various sanctions that condition our conduct. And he offers a fairly elaborate typology that he intends, by which he intends to distinguish the various different characteristic sources of these sanctions. And in his different works, he typologizes them in different ways. In the Deontology, he distinguishes 5 different kinds of sanctions. I'm going to conflate them into 4, which is consistent with some of his other writings. There are physical sanctions, there are social, moral, or as he sometimes says, popular sanctions, there are political or legal sanctions, and there are religious sanctions. And each of these refers to a particular source in human experience of pleasures and pains that condition how we confront the choices that we face day to day. So let's talk a little bit about each of these in turn. The physical sanction refers to sources of pleasures and pains that arise simply from our body, right? So we are hardwired, we are naturally constructed physiologically as beings that have the capacity to experience certain forms of pleasure and pain just physically, right? So we have the capacity, for example, for enormous pleasurable sensations, right? At the extreme, I suppose, sorry to be crude about it, orgasm would be such a physical sanction. It's a physical capability. It's something that the human body can produce, and it generates enormous pleasure. But other forms of pleasure too, the pleasure of laughing at a good joke, the pleasure of eating really delicious food, right? That's all given to us by our bodies, and it's in that sense a physical sanction that, a bit like a Hobbesian appetite, is going to incline us towards certain kinds of activities. On the opposite side, at the extreme, our bodies also have the capability of generating very powerful forms of pain. Agony, for example, is a particularly intense kind of pain that has the property that while you're undergoing it, you desperately want it to stop. But there are other more moderate forms of pain and discomfort. Think of the discomfort that is caused when you feel very hungry or very thirsty, right? It's an unpleasant physiological state, right? You're craving something, and it's not enjoyable to be in that state. And that operates as a sanction in Bentham's sense, because it motivates us to get up out of our chair or to drive to the supermarket and buy and consume a nice cool bottle of beer or something to kind of cool us down if we're feeling the discomfort of thirst. So those are the physical sanctions. They're sort of physiological capabilities, physiological sources in our bodily constitution that make it possible for us to directly experience certain forms of pleasurable or painful arousal. Secondly, he describes a number of social or moral sanctions. And here he has in mind things like the pleasure that we obtain from commanding the love and respect of other people. Conversely, the pain we experience when we are greeted with hostility or hatred or contempt in the eyes of others. That's the more specifically social or popular sanction, right? And again, Bentham thinks that this is something that tends to incline us towards certain actions and to deter us from certain other actions. Sometimes we will avoid taking certain forms of actions for fear that if we perform those actions, we will inspire hatred or contempt or disgust in the eyes of others. That's something that is aversive to us, and so it operates as a sanction. It deters us from engaging in certain kinds of behaviors. But it's important to note, particularly with regard to what Bentham calls the moral sanction, that some of these sanctions work introspectively. They work just inside of us, right? And here what he has in mind, in particular, are the feelings of guilt and shame that sometimes attend actions that we're not very proud of. When we act wrongly, we often feel guilty about what we have done. And the important thing about guilt, and also for about shame from a utilitarian point of view, this is the point of his theory this is the point of his describing them as a sanction. These are sources of pain, right? We talk about pangs of guilt, and it's not. I mean, all of us have been in this situation, right? We can't sleep because we've crossed a friend or we've betrayed somebody. We feel bad about it, and it's a very unpleasant experience, right? We beat ourselves up, as we say metaphorically. But the metaphor of beating ourselves up implies a certain kind of self-recrimination. It implies a certain kind of self-punishment. And what's important about that for Bentham is that this implies the experience of pain and suffering. It's not enjoyable to be in that state. When Bentham and the classical utilitarians talk about morality and about ethics, more often than not, they're thinking about it in that way. They're not thinking about morality or ethics as a natural lawyer might, as a kind of shimmering body of rules that have a sort of transcendental or divine sanction or special standing. They think about morality as operating in a more psychological and sociological way, just as a set of norms and accompanying psychological dispositions that motivate us to avoid certain kinds of actions and motivate us to engage in certain kinds of actions. And here again, Hume is quite important. I mention this because Bentham and Mill, although of course in lots of ways they're radicals and trying to get away from traditional morality, they nonetheless accept and indeed give quite a large role to the faculty of what we would ordinarily call conscience, because conscience is the source of these kinds of guilt pangs, right? These feelings of shame that are consequent on our wrongdoing, or sometimes that we anticipate in advance of performing a certain kind of action, and then deter us from performing that kind of action, right? If I'm worried that if I do this, I'm going to feel terrible about myself because I'm going to feel awfully guilty about doing it, that sanction, that negative sanction, might incline me against performing that action. And when Bentham and Mill think about morality, they think about it as operating in a direct psychological way on agents' motivations in that fashion. They're distinctive sources of pleasure and pain. I've mostly focused here on the pain, the negative sanctions that are accompanied by things like guilt pangs. But, in principle, morality also comes with certain kinds of motivations that give us pleasure, right? A sense of pride, a sense of accomplishment, a sense of personal elevation in having acted rightly and having treated our friends well, right? That, again, for Bentham would be a positive sanction that derives from our moral sensibility as it's been inculcated in us, as we've been socialized into various kinds of moral dispositions and feelings and sentiments. Again, all of this is coming out of Hume in lots of ways. Thirdly, and of course very, very important for political theory, Bentham distinguishes a source of political and especially legal sanctions. And here, of course, he's thinking of punishment, right? Legal penalties, being forced to submit to a legal punishment, that involves the suffering of pain, right? I mean, that's built into our idea of a punishment, right? You are punished when you are burdened by some sacrifice. You're put in prison, you're deprived of your freedom, you're made to pay a fine, or in the extreme case, you're executed, you lose your life. All of these things are, of course, from a utilitarian point of view, bad, because they imply harm or pain or the loss of future pleasure in the case of death. If your life is curtailed early by an execution, then you lose all of the potential enjoyments that you might have experienced in the remaining years of your life that are cut short by a death. But included in this too, especially for Bentham, are various kinds of positive sanctions, right? Because the state can provide positive incentives to people to behave in certain kinds of ways. When the IRS gives me a tax break or a tax deduction for that portion of my earned income that I give to Oxfam or some charitable cause, the state provides me with a positive sanction, an incentive to give more of my income to charity by shielding that income from taxation, right? So formal political institutions can also sanction our conduct in both positive and negative ways in that way. And finally, he talks about the possibility of religious sanctions. This is the form of pain and suffering that we experience when we contemplate the prospect of being punished eternally in the afterlife or achieving eternal bliss in heaven, right? I don't want to talk very much about this. I don't think Bentham takes the religious sanction very seriously, although in principle he recognizes that the religious sanction might indeed have some use in conditioning human behavior towards beneficial as opposed to nefarious and welfare depressing ways. So once you take account of all of this, this elaborate psychological theory of sanctions, I think one starts to realize that Bentham is not to be interpreted as a kind of naive utilitarian moralist who is simply asking us to apply the utility principle directly to our individual choices. It's not as if, for Bentham, the proposal is that each of us should have the utility principle before our eyes every moment of our waking lives and be constantly asking anytime we face a decision, well, what can I do right now to bring about the greatest happiness for the greatest number? That, I think, is not Bentham's picture, because as I've tried to emphasize, his psychological theory of the various sorts of sanctions that provide us with sources of pain and pleasure that in fact condition our daily choices, that suggests that he has a more sophisticated and realistic picture of how human beings actually live and how indeed they should live. So if he's not a naive utilitarian moralist who is asking us to directly apply the utility principle directly to our choices, how should we then take him? Well, I think you should see him as assuming rather that if they're rational, individuals will and indeed should seek to maximize their own pleasure and pain by responding in a rational way, in a self-interested way, to the sanctions that they actually confront, the particular configuration of pleasures and pains that these various sources of sanctions confront them with. They should recognize, furthermore, that their self-interested choices are far more likely to produce misery and pain than they are to be highly productive of other people's welfare. When you put those two precepts together, you get what I think is Bentham's characteristic orientation, namely that the main goal of utilitarian social and political reform is not to ask people to constantly be trying to calculate how they individually can promote overall utility. Rather, the goal of utilitarian social and political reform is to pay attention to the large-scale operation of the various sanctions that in fact do confront individuals and their daily choices. And what we should be trying to do as utilitarian reformers is to think about the optimal modifications to that pattern of sanctions that will incline and motivate agents not to behave in ways that are likely to bring about large-scale harms. So understood in that way, the primary object of Benthamite social criticism is to consider the way that norms, expectations, legal punishments especially, this configuration of sanctions that we confront in our day-to-day lives, is to consider how they're configured and to ask whether they in fact motivate agents to behave in ways that tend towards or against overall welfare. And if we discover that these configurations of sanctions incline individuals to behave in ways that are very harmful collectively, then we should try to modify and reform them, and perhaps in some cases completely eliminate them. In the Deontology, Bentham gives his nice, wonderfully Victorian little fable about Walter Wise and Timothy Thoughtless. He gives this little example to kind of summarize in a kind of fairy tale form the intended lesson of all of this story, all of this account of the sanctions that affect people. So I'm not going to review the example, you've read it yourself, but Timothy Thoughtless acts foolishly in various ways, and as a result of this, he suffers physical harm, his health declines, he loses friends and their respect, people think he's an asshole, people think of him as having a dubious character, he's racked with guilt and shame, he constantly feels bad about himself for screwing up so royally, and as far as the religious sanction is concerned, he feels uneasy about his standing with God. He also winds up, as I recall, in prison. He suffers legal penalties and so on. And Bentham is trying to point out that Timothy Thoughtless is thus behaving irrationally. He's failing to respond properly to the sanctions that apply to him, and he's therefore harming himself. Walter Wise does the opposite. He behaves in the opposite way to Timothy Thoughtless. He responds as one should, as a self-interested agent, to the presence of these various sanctions, and as a result, he is more healthy, He is physically happy. He's got lots of friends. He garners widespread social recognition. That makes him happy. He isn't racked with guilt and shame, but rather can take a kind of pride in his existence. He isn't constantly monitored and punished by the legal authorities. And he has a good conscience with regard to his standing with God, if Walter is a religious person. And this example, it's a kind of idealized example, of course. It's supposed to illustrate, I take it, a case in which the incentives and disincentives, the sanctions that apply to individuals, will, if they function properly, they will in fact encourage individuals to behave in ways that are both socially useful and in their own self-interest. If the relevant sanctions operate effectively, Bentham's thought seems to be, more people will be like Walter than Timothy, and that will not only be better for the individuals concerned, it will also be better for everyone, because the kinds of behaviors that Walter engages with are behaviors that actually promote the welfare of others, whereas the kinds of behaviors that Timothy engages in actually suppress the welfare of others. I mean, Timothy at one point assaults somebody, and of course, obviously, that other person is harmed by that assault. But of course, because he assaults this other person, the law gets involved, and of course, we then have to spend money trying him, and we have to support him in prison when we punish him. That's all a kind of drag on social resources. So the example is supposed to illustrate a case in which these sanctions, positive and negative, if people respond rationally to them, will not only ensure that the individuals concerned promote their own self-interest, they will also tend to produce outcomes that are better for everyone. It's worth noting, too, that on the utilitarian view, sometimes accepting short-term pains can be a rational thing for individuals to do if they produce longer-term benefits. This is something that Timothy Thoughtless fails to recognize, because he's constantly giving into temptations to do things that will make him happy in the short term by punching at somebody in the face, but actually gets him into trouble in the long term, because he winds up in prison, say. And that's the way we think about things like dieting or training for a marathon, right? Dieting is not something that is a lot of fun, right? We have to sacrifice ourselves in various ways. We're constantly having these cravings, and we're constantly having to resist these cravings. Sorry about the squirrels who are currently pelting my study with acorns. That's the noise going on in the background. When we're dieting, we're often in a state of discomfort, right? It's unpleasant to constantly be resisting the temptation to meet our cravings by snacking from stuff in the fridge, right? But in a case like this, enduring that short-term discomfort of going on a diet can be a rational thing for individuals to do when it brings about longer-term benefits. It keeps us healthy. It ensures that we don't have a heart attack at 50. It will enable us to be fit and able to do other things in the future that we might very much want to do and would bring us a very large amount of happiness. If I want to have a really happy hiking holiday in the mountains, for example, I need to be fit enough to take advantage of that opportunity. And if I'm hopelessly unfit and get out of breath after walking 200 yards, then I won't be able to do that. And so sometimes dieting, exercising, I mean, nobody likes going to the gym. It's a rebarbative activity, but sometimes it can be rational for people to impose these costs on themselves for the sake of a longer-term benefit. So notice these kinds of cases of rational self-sacrifice are for Bentham and the utilitarians not like cases of asceticism, right? In the case of asceticism, somebody forgoes pleasure just for the sake of it, just because they think it's sinful to eat chocolate. Or to masturbate or something like that, right? And that, as I said in the last lecture, Bentham just regards as flat crazy. It's nuts. Why on earth would you deny yourself a harmless pleasure? But when we go on a diet, it's a different kind of thing. We're not sacrificing ourselves for no benefit at all. Rather, we're sacrificing ourselves now in order to produce a longer-term benefit in the future. And Bentham isn't denying that that's perfectly rational. He would say that's not really a case of asceticism. It's simply a person accepting a short-term sacrifice for the sake of greater pleasure overall later. Note too that although Bentham and Mill think that negative sanctions are always unpleasant, right? Think of pangs of conscience or social sanctions, being subjected to the criticism of one's fellows, right? This is always a bad experience, right? Being subjected to public ridicule or experiencing the pangs of conscience and feeling ashamed of what you've done. These are very, very unpleasant experiences. But nonetheless, Bentham thinks they can be quite useful because they can sometimes motivate people to behave better than they might otherwise do. If you think about the Me Too movement, this would be a good illustration, right? The Me Too movement has basically been naming and shaming celebrities, putting them in the online virtual stocks and basically lobbing virtual rotten eggs at them and opening them to public ridicule and public criticism. And maybe we think, as Bentham might have thought, that this is a very salutary exercise, because to the extent that the operation of those negative sanctions will deter other men from behaving in boorish, assholish ways, and in therefore eventually sparing women the insecurity and anxiety of being constantly subject to sexual violence and various forms of unwanted sexual assault, they may actually be quite useful. But of course, other times, these pangs of conscience are completely useless from a utilitarian standpoint. And that, of course, is Bentham's view about the traditional taboos about things like homosexual sex or masturbation, pointless rules of etiquette and politeness that actually hinder useful and robust mutual discourse. All of these are cases in which society it sanctions people, but to no good purpose, right? They simply suppress perfectly harmless and in some cases quite beneficial human behaviors. And in that kind of case, the operation of these sanctions can be very bad. So if we summarize all of this and systematize it, what you see Bentham doing in his theory of the sanctions of utility, he's offering quite a sophisticated account of when and under what conditions the use of certain negative and positive sanctions might be useful, all things considered, from the standpoint of general utility. So this little diagram hopefully clarifies and makes more systematic Bentham's view. So the two categories on the left that define the two horizontal rows, that's a distinction between sanctions that are negative, that is, sanctions that involve the experience or anticipation of pain, and positive sanctions that involve the experience or anticipation of certain kinds of pleasures. And then the two vertical columns are defined by what is useful, all things considered, or useless, all things considered, when one looks at their overall consequences in relation to aggregate welfare. And if we just go through the four cells that this then logically creates, you can see, roughly speaking, what Bentham's proposal looks like. So in the northwestern corner, this is the combination of a case in which we identify certain negative sanctions, experiences of pain or anticipations of pain, that are, all things considered, quite useful from a utilitarian standpoint. These are cases of pain suffered by agents that is outweighed by the beneficial consequences of their suffering it. So if you want a straightforward example of this, think of the physical sanction, right? So one of the things that our bodies do for us is that they give us very powerful signals in the form of pain that certain kinds of activities are bad for us, right? So, our bodies experience searing heat as pain, right? So many of you, certainly this happened to me when I was a young child, we saw the dancing flames in the fireplace and we thought, wow, this is really beautiful. I wonder what they feel like. And so you put your hand in the fire to try to feel the flames. And of course, you experience a very, very powerful burning sensation, which causes you to withdraw your hand. And that's, of course, a very good thing, because you're not going to do it again. You're going to learn your lesson, right? This is a case of the propitious operation of the physical sanction, of a negative physical sanction. And Bentham's general account of legal punishment, legal sanctions, when it's appropriate, goes exactly like that. He says, well, punishments are justified, the negative legal sanctions are justified when by punishing a few people in a way that will deter many, many others from behaving in similar ways at a relatively low social cost, then the principle of utility recommends that we impose those forms of pain on the few for the sake of benefits that will accrue to the many. Moving down to the southwestern quadrant, this is the possibility of positive sanctions that involve the experience or anticipation of pleasure that turn out to have useful overall consequences from the standpoint of general welfare. These are incentives that might spur agents to act in ways that contribute to overall happiness. So, for example, to take a case that would be fall under Bentham's social sanction, think of the practice of conferring recognition in the forms of prizes, informal forms of fame, or the conferral of honors on agents who have accomplished a lot for society. Right, the Nobel Prize in medicine will go to people who have come up with drugs that save people's lives. You might think that incentivizing pharmaceutical companies or medical researchers in that way to try to come up with better remedies for painful, horrible diseases, that's a very good way to use positive sanctions to promote overall welfare. Moving to the right-hand side of your diagram there, in the northeast quadrant, we have cases of negative sanctions involving pain that are largely useless. This is imposing suffering on people in a way that only depresses welfare with no net benefit. And Bentham gives a lot of attention to this, especially in the context of legal punishment, because he thinks that often the legal sanctions that the state imposes on people are in fact pointless and have no utilitarian justification. And he gives a neat little taxonomy of 4 different ways in which this can be true. He says sometimes legal punishments are groundless. This is the case where actually we're punishing something that does no harm whatsoever. That might be true, for example, of legal sanctions against smoking weed or doing shrooms or some forms of alcohol consumption. These are all things that one could argue actually bring people pleasure and don't do any great harm. And so punishing these kinds of actions is groundless, as Bentham would say. Sometimes legal sanctions are, as he says, inefficacious. They'll be inefficacious when the deterrent effect of the punishment will in fact be too weak to actually deter people, but perhaps because the motives that lead people to want to engage in that activity are simply too insistent and too overpowering for any fear of legal punishment to actually prevent them from engaging in the relevant action. Sometimes punishments are unprofitable. They might indeed deter people from engaging in the relevant action, but they come at such a high price that it's not worth performing that kind of punishment. And sometimes punishments are needless, as he puts it. They're needless when it's the case that we could prevent the relevant mischief, as he puts it, in a more effective way without punishing anybody after the fact. The classic example of this would be if you're thinking about crime that is caused by poverty or deprivation. You might think that the better way to deal with that problem, rather than waiting for poor people to fall into a life of crime and then punishing them after the fact, it might be better to tackle the underlying causes and make sure that people don't suffer the kind of poverty and deprivation that leads them to perform these offenses and crimes. That's the kind of thing. So these are all cases in which negative sanctions will start to look relatively pointless or unjustified from the standpoint of overall welfare. And then, of course, also sometimes there are positive sanctions that spur, this is the bottom right quadrant, there are positive sanctions that actually spur agents to act in ways that depress overall welfare. If you want a good example of this in the political sphere, think of the way in which the current political system systematically rewards politicians who are conceited braggarts, liars, who are encouraged constantly to reduce complicated and difficult political questions to crude slogans, propagandist, mindless pandering to interest groups and so forth, in ways that probably lead to very, very poor public policy making, right? Wouldn't it be better, a utilitarian might argue, if the system, rather than rewarding these kinds of traits, actually punished these traits and gave politicians active incentives for coming up with policies and proposals and arguing with the public in ways that are likely to promote propitious and effective public policy making in the common interest. And if you think that way about the organization of the political system, then you're thinking about it in very much the way that classical utilitarians recommend. So let me conclude this by drawing your attention to John Stuart Mill's famous 1868 Defending Capital Punishment, which I think is a useful document for testing your own judgments about how plausible this general utilitarian approach to thinking about social reform really is. You might want to focus on this in your discussion sections. As I say, this is a parliamentary speech that Mill made in 1868, but it is nonetheless an authentically utilitarian argument. This is particularly clear in the passage on page 270, where Mill says, look, it's just a mistake in this context to sacralize life per se, right? He says, look, it's not human life only, not human life as such that ought to be sacred to us, but human feelings, characteristic utilitarian thought. The human capacity of suffering, Mill continues, is what we should cause to be respected, not the mere capacity of existing, right? So we shouldn't sort of engage in this idolatry of life as such and treat it as a kind of sacred dogma. What really matters in this context, Mill says, and here he's thinking in entirely utilitarian terms, is the quality of people's life, the actual hedonic experience of people's lives. And once we've set aside these traditional dogmas about the sacredness of life, Mill thinks that makes room for a sober utilitarian assessment of the benefits and costs of capital punishment. And his view of capital punishment is very interesting and provocative. And again, he's thinking in a completely utilitarian way about it. He thinks the great virtue of capital punishment from a utilitarian point of view is that it brings about a very high deterrent benefit. Capital punishment is a very, very high deterrent value for relatively little actual suffering, especially if execution is conducted painlessly and very swiftly upon conviction. So we can it's difficult to discuss this in the context of the United States today, because of course the United States today has this very weird system in which if you're convicted of a capital crime, you then have to sort of rot for years on what's called death row. And so in practice, capital punishment in the United States is very much like a long prison sentence. And of course, Mill isn't thinking of anything like this. He's assuming that once we've convicted someone of a serious crime for which capital punishment might be appropriate, then we will execute them relatively swiftly. And Mill thinks, look, that's actually not really something that depresses anybody's welfare to a great extent. But the great virtue of capital punishment is that it brings a very high deterrent benefit, because very, very few things in life excite a powerful dread more than fear of death. So he thinks there's a very high probability that attaching the punishment of execution to certain crimes, that's likely to have a very powerful deterrent effect in deterring people from engaging in certain kinds of actions. Because if you think your life is on the line for performing a certain kind of action, that might terrify a lot of people out of performing the relevant acts. Compare that, Mill says, with very long prison sentences. These have very low deterrent benefits because the prospect of being put up at the cost of the state in a prison. Okay, so it's not a hotel; it's a pretty unpleasant place to live. But you're still alive. You can still have some enjoyments. There'll be a library in the prison and so forth. It's not a completely worthless kind of existence. This is not something that is really going to deter anyone very much. So it's going to have low deterrent benefit, but it's actually going to involve quite a lot of actual suffering, because if you're in prison for a long period of time and you're a utilitarian, you're going to have to compute the suffering over all of those days. It all adds up over time. If you're in prison for 20 years, that's 20 years of a pretty miserable existence, and that amounts to quite a lot of disutility. And of course, prisons are expensive places to maintain. You have to pay prison guards. You have to make sure the buildings aren't collapsing. You have to put all sorts of security mechanisms in place. You have to feed the prisoners, and that imposes a heavy burden on the public fisc, and that too is very much on the debit side of the utilitarian equation. And so Mill thinks that, compared to long prison sentences, which have low deterrent effect but high cost, capital punishment is a pretty effective way of deterring people without actually causing a great deal of physical pain. Now, the obvious response is to say, well, but there's actually very little empirical evidence that execution is all that deterrent. There is no canonical or consensus view about this. If you look at the sociological, criminological literature, it is indeed very ambiguous. But it does seem to me that at an intuitive level, there's something right about Mill's general point. You should ask yourself, well, if the punishment for speeding were execution and not merely a $40 fine, how often would you be driving over the speed limit? And if you think that if you were afraid of dying as a result of driving at 67 miles an hour on an interstate freeway, if you think that you probably wouldn't if you thought that the cop who pulls you over appears from behind a shrub and gives you a speeding ticket, if you thought that they would then say, well, you need to show up at the public gallows in 3 weeks and we'll hang you, probably you wouldn't speed quite so much. Now, of course, no one is suggesting, least of all Mill, that we should punish speeders by execution. But that example does suggest that there's something right about Mill's general thought that execution does have quite a powerful deterrent effect. And so you should think about this perhaps in your discussion sections. Okay, enough for today. Thank you very much for listening. I'll push on and say much more about Mill in the next lecture. Thank you for listening.